Well, we'll go ahead and dive in, and other folks may log on. And oh, yeah, there's more folks logging in now, but we're going to go ahead and just get rolling so we can use as much time as we have. And I think all of y'all have been here in past weeks, you know, a little bit of who we are and how this works. Um, but I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I'm Lacey. I'm leading the retreat today. And I'm really happy to be partnering with ACCA to put on this series. And big thanks to Canada Council for the Arts, who is providing financial funding to make this possible. So, uh, thank you to all of those parties. And also, before we start, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from the traditional and stolen land of the Gamahave Mohawk, a place that has served for a gathering and community and sharing site for many, many years. And I know that y'all are joining kind of from all over the place across Turtle Island and want to just take a moment to really recognize the historical oppression of the lands and the cultures and the original peoples who lived on and live on the lands in which we currently live on and join from. And kind of sticking with the theme, I'm just going to share kind of a brief article that you can click and just save for later. I think for me, I always am looking for how do I take these types of like recognitions and sort of bringing this into my regular daily life thought and connect it into whatever the topic is or things that we're exploring. And so I've been learning more about kind of the ideas of digital equity and kind of how there's some layers of digital equity and concerns and issues and challenges and areas of creation in Indigenous communities and the layers of that. So just a random link to pique your interest. And yeah, we'll dive right into things. So, some of you may have, and some of you may not. But last week, a survey was sent out asking, "Are there things that you want more of, or are really hoping will be covered or touched on in the series?" And this one, and then the next one will also be kind of like open free form. And I'm going to paste that link again. So if you didn't see that or want to add something in, I will look at it again after today's training before next week. So that is there. And yeah, I want to just like stay and recognize, and I know that I've kind of been talking about this throughout, um, the reality of knowing that it's like there's far more than we could ever actually cover in any specific time. And even within looking at the requests, it's really interesting how like counter certain things are. And it's like things that someone wants are like the exact opposite of what someone else wants. And some people like loved last week's exploratory training, and other people didn't really like it or find that style that useful. And some folks wanted like a lot more on whiteboards. Some folks wanted anything but whiteboards. There was quite a diverse kind of request pool. And so with that, like I just want to acknowledge that I know that we may not, we're not going to meet every single person's need in every single way that all of us likely would like. But we are going to still cover lots of different things. And so some of the things I'm going to share on the screen here. Um, some things that we're going to definitely look into and sort of talk about and have discussion about today. I want to make sure that we do have time for kind of information exchange amongst ourselves, for identifying kind of like what are our personal next steps with the information we've been talking about, with kind of whatever's on your mind in terms of digital literacy in general. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of questions that have come up and thoughts and areas of continued thinking around copyright and kind of protecting intellectual property and privatization and sort of things becoming public and all of these pieces. We're going to look through and kind of talk about like kind of do like little like case studies on questions that we may find ourselves asking and things that you all may be asking, and kind of hitting some things around themes of ethics and mindful usage, etc. We may not do all this today. Some of this may spill over into the following week. But yeah, that's a little bit about kind of where we're going and headed. I know for I think a lot of us with this topic in particular, and I feel this too, that it is so big and expansive and sometimes hard to like feel like it is a simple thing because it really isn't a simple thing in so many ways that um, we often want like an answer or the thing to hold on to that will make it all clear. And I think it's hard with this because it is such an expansive, huge category that it. I think the thing that actually is most clear is when we're able to hold on how to navigate kind of the uncertainty of it and get the info we need. And so we're looking into that. Yeah. Any questions, comments, thoughts? Feel free to chat box it. You can unmute anytime, as usual. But otherwise, we'll just keep moving. Um, I'm going to present a little bit of information on this and just sort of talk about this topic that came up, and then we'll engage in some conversation amongst ourselves about this too. And someone had brought up, and I think this is like a really interesting to think about. And the person who brought this up, you're welcome to speak to this and whatever's kind of on your mind about this as well in a moment, because I do think it's really relevant and interesting to think about. And there'd been kind of mention of this idea of like, yeah, how do we like protect work, protect property, like copyright, more like all of these pieces kind of within our digital landscape. And I think there are huge things to think about here, some of which are not in my area of expertise because I'm not an attorney who can actually tell you all the legal implications of all of these things. But I want to open the discussion on it and share some resources. So when I think about this topic, which there's more to this beyond this, which we'll talk about, but I'm often thinking about in kind of the digital realm, like what are the ways that we're protecting our own work in terms of sharing across platforms with collaborators? Because a lot of times now, as the person I'd spoken to had mentioned, kind of in uh, our communication, especially when we're doing shorter term collaborations or contract work, or we're maybe not like working within a single organization, but are maybe like doing this project with this person and this other project with this other person, and using all sorts of digital tools to share information, whether that's like Google Drive or Dropbox, or sharing it in a more text-based platform like a Slack communication or Teams. And what are the different implications of that in terms of our continuing access to that shared data, other people's continued access to that shared data, et cetera? And how are the ways that we are or aren't being mindful about that? And then also some of the bigger questions around kind of like public space and AI and copyright and all of these pieces. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, and then I want to kind of have some discussion about it. But things that I think are important to keep in mind when it comes to sharing information with other folks that we're collaborating with in kind of the digital realm, especially like if we're, maybe we live a different place than people, is thinking through where and how are we sharing the documents, the work that we're sharing, which is obviously going to vary a lot based on the type of consulting and the type of work that you're doing. This may look very, very different depending on what you're doing. But I like thinking about as well, like what agreements are in place about the work access and how is this going to change after we're done with whatever the project is. So I think about when this person, like brought this up, I was thinking about it and I was like, oh yeah, how many people have access to something in my Google Drives that I've just like completely forgotten about that they have access to or that we both have access to? Like so many. Like probably there's names in there of people that I'm like, oh yeah, I haven't even talked to that person in years. And depending on what that document is, that may or may not actually matter, right? But it definitely helped me to think about like, oh yeah, I do want to keep more mindfulness around like who does have access to things and how is that access given? In addition to thinking about depending on what digital tools and platforms you're using, thinking about how much control do you have over something that has been shared. So, for example, like a Google document, I can share and set it as you are an editor or just a viewer. But then also, even if someone's just a viewer, they could control copy the text and put it in their own document potentially, which again may not matter, but there. Can I take away their access? And if you leave either that team grouping or that platform, what happens to those materials, right? And kind of thinking about those pieces. I'm curious, like, as kind of we're thinking about this, talking about this, what maybe does come up for folks or what's on your mind around these topics? Is it something you're thinking about? Would love to hear it.
I can talk.
Yeah, sure.
It's interesting. I'm on a team right now. It's a huge team. It's all being managed through Teams. All the information is basically everybody's. Apparently, it's not authored per se. There's no direct liability, but I am interested in what happens once the project ends, or even if you leave the project, like if your time is done,
Mhm.
how you protect yourself and, and whether you can ensure that you get because basically at this point, all the documents are mine and all my documents are theirs.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, totally. And I think it is yeah, exactly these pieces. And just as a sidebar, because I was going to try to separate out these links, but I pressed enter before I meant to on the Zoom chat. Um, I pasted in several links that I recommend that if this is an interesting topic to you, that you copy paste and put somewhere else to kind of look at them differently, because it hits on a variety of angles of these things. It doesn't answer it exactly, but that really talks about and pulls apart some of just the things about like copyright and what is copyrightable and what isn't, and like those types of pieces, and some good like interviews with lawyers who are experts on this and talk about it from even like the arts perspective and all of those pieces. So it may just be interesting to kind of learn about. Um, and I think exactly kind of Lynn, what you were saying, that like this is something that makes sense for us to have on our mind, and they're likely, depending on the work that we're doing, there maybe isn't necessarily like a simple answer, because the things that are shared could potentially be all kinds of things. And I think that there's a couple of layers to it. Like one is like, what are our agreements on the like people side of things, right? Like, are we having conversations or engaging in like work to make sure that we have shared expectations that are the same about what does happen with this after we're done working together, and that may vary based on, is that content that was yours originally that you shared in support of this collective thing, is that content something that you and whoever else co-created, in which case who has the right to use it where, what are the kind of rules and context of that. And I think that's sort of the like people side of things. And then there's this digital side of things too, of thinking about, particularly like if you're working within an organization and they all use whatever platform they're using, and you are participating in the usage of that platform in the creative process, and you do retain like some ownership over those things that you created. How do you also make sure that you have either access to those things or copies of those things when you maybe are no longer in that system? um, and I think that's going to vary a lot depending on what is the system that you're using and what is the way that it is being used. Because, for example, something like Teams, if you're completely outside of Teams moving forward and are no longer having like access to their shared platform, that may look different than if you and I just created a shared Google Drive that isn't inherently like, part of our organizational like closed space. Um, and so yeah, I think these are like the answer varies, but having the kind of the recognition and awareness of like, what is my access going to be? And what do I do with that information? Like, do I want to make sure as a consultant that before we wrap up this project, just for my own coverage, that I make sure to go in and make copies to save on my personal computer outside of this drive that maybe I don't own, because I do own, the content or whatever we created. Because sometimes also it's like an organization might delete whatever it is, or someone new comes in, they don't know what it is. So it gets shuffled outside of your shared folder, but now you suddenly don't have access to it. Right. So thinking about like, how do you protect for you these pieces? Um, and then I think there's the other layer of like, does this like digital space have any kind of ownership over the content in general, which I would say most of the like work kinds of things that we're using don't retain that ownership. Like Google can't take a document that's private out of my Google Drive and like use it for their own benefit. But some of the language around like social media, um, uh, things are a lot less clear, right? And so there is a lot more room for you to not exactly have ownership of things in the way that you want to, or maybe think you do. Um, and I do find one of the things that one of the articles that's really interesting, the one that I linked to is uh, it's a, you know, I think it's the text of a podcast with the like, oh gosh, what's it called? Like intellectual property office through the government. And it's with a copyright attorney who talks a lot about like when is something copyrightable or not in terms of like even like an internet meme, of like, okay, well, I posted this and it's something I created, but then it takes the life of its own. Like, what does that mean? What is or isn't copyrightable? Like, what are the sort of different um sort of like stipulations on that to where maybe it technically meets the copyright laws, but if you really tried to sue for that in court, it would go this way or that way. So I think it's really, I found those things really interesting. Um, yeah, Kathleen, totally. I'm curious when you say have provisions been made, do you mean just like with the person or folks that you're working with? Like have y'all made the provisions or uh do you mean like through the digital tool or potentially both?
Hi, I mean, actually among the people, because most
Totally.
of it, I can't tell you how many projects I've been on that I go, "Oh, okay, so is someone saving all this?"
Yes. Totally. Yes. Very, very much. Yes, absolutely. And being I think it's like, yes, you're completely right. And I think because there is so much more collaboration in person with people from all over the place and sort of the ease of jumping into creating something shared in a way that didn't exist before when it was either we are sitting in this room and okay, where's our folder that this is going in? Um, and I think it is quite easy for things to end up in all kinds of squirrely places. Yeah. And so I think having these pieces on our mind and bringing like the intentional awareness to that exploration as we are diving into creation is really important and interesting to be thinking about. Yeah. Any other thoughts that come up for folks kind of on in this domain? Yeah, Kathleen, I see your virtual hand. Go for it.
It might be worth considering as arts consultants that maybe some investigation be made for, um thinking about designing agreements or templates for agreements and all that as part of the kind of work that we would normally do. I mean, as a dramaturg, it's it it's all often left to me to be a like, oh, did we agree on how we were going to communicate? it's
Totally.
is that kind of thing. So anyway, um,
No, I completely agree that I think it's so important that this has come up because it's just one of those things that it's like, oh yeah, there isn't a simple answer on this, but it's part of this like how do we be with and ensure that these things are present and like being addressed and explored in a world so that later we don't get to a point where we're like, oh, I need that thing and I don't have access to it, or we are on a different wavelength about where and how these things get to be used. Yeah, and I think that's super important. Um, oh yeah, Lynn, do you mean the like the shared domain of like how arts or documents or whatever can just sort of be like are less sort of like ownable in a way because there's often easier sort of digital collaboration happening. Is that what you mean? Or do you mean something else? Feel free to clarify that.
I'm on a board right now, and I'm just interested in how it's on Google Docs, and no one is like the administrator. No one knows. And I'm just like new to the board, and I'm like swimming, trying to figure out, okay, how does this work? And where do I find stuff? And how do I make sure that things are properly filed? Because nobody's got that responsibility.
Totally. Yes. And it is, I think, a really important context. And then I'll come to you, Roger, after this. I see your virtual hand. It makes me think about when you said that, Lynn, exactly that there's, you can have, like, if you're using Google for your like work space, or like an organization is using Google, or even just you personally are using it, like I forget what there's called, like professional Google or what, like I forget what their tier is of that, what the name of it is. Um, but I've definitely worked in places where the organization, like the theater, had their like theater hubbed Google Drive that is something that, like, no matter if I leave or someone else leaves, the documents we created, if they're created in the like theater's hub Google Drive, remain there. But that if I've like created the document in like my work but personal, like Lacey at theater.com Google Drive, that if I leave, those documents suddenly aren't accessible, or can be depending on how it's structured. And so definitely, I think it's really valid to be looking at, wait, who owns these documents, and or who is at least the like the host of them, the administrator of the document, even outside of like, is this my intellectual property? But like, who is the host of this, and is that hosting center secure to where that person just can't delete things, because obviously we hope that we're all getting along and working well together, but we also don't want a single person to have the capacity to delete our entire organizational infrastructure, right? But also, if that person just also transitions jobs, how do we make sure that they haven't accidentally created documents on their individual Google versus ours, for example? This is true across a lot of different platforms. So I think that's a really valid thing that you feel some uneasiness without having that answered. And I think that is definitely an important thing to look at and try to get some clarity about who who is who has access to this for sure. Yeah, Roger.
Y- yes, I'm wondering if there's any sort of protocol for closing out a project because yes, it's a lot of short-term projects. Um, I usually use Google Docs for as a digital space
Mhm,
to draft and
mhm.
to collaborate on drafts. But I always go to a final uh, uh, for a final version. It would not end up being on the Google Drive. But the question really is, how do you close out after a project in it, sort of to preserve some sort of digital hygiene or some sort of digital security around the intellectual work that's been done in the Google Drive? Is there a protocol for that to well close out a Google Drive after a project?
That is an excellent question. I don't know of one off the top of my mind. I'm curious if anyone else knows of one. Be like, feel free to share, but I putting it on my list to do some research on before next time, because yeah, I don't know of any, and I think it's interesting to me too as we're talking about this, where all of us, it sounds like, have this like, oh yeah, this is an interesting thing and potentially really important, and yet I've never, not only do I not know of like a specific model that exists, but I've never actually even experienced a like structured closeout process in that addresses these things as fully as I think ideally they could be. Yeah, Robert, thoughts on this or something else?
Oh, some thoughts on this. I was going to say, what we did a few years ago was add into all of our contracts that any work done over the process of the project remains our intellectual property. So that at the end of it, everything is saved in our Google Drive. The client may have stuff on their Google Drive, and that's fine, but everything remains with us so that we going forward. I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what we do.
Totally. Do y'all have a process? Because I definitely have things like that similar in contracts, but do y'all have a process where there's any kind of like checking or confirmation of that, or is it just kind of mindful in the process and like hoping that everything's kind of in the right place at the end, or is there like a structured kind of checking and reviewing of anything that happens for y'all? Yeah, like I think I've experienced a lot of work had been noted of like, yeah, closing and archiving left to whoever is interested or thinking about it. Um, yeah, but I think it makes a lot of sense to, before we're even creating, thinking about what happens to these things afterwards? Who retains those ownership pieces? And how do we ensure that we're setting ourselves up for success along the way of the project so that at the end we don't have to suddenly go, oh, okay, reassign this and recreate this and have ease with that. Yeah, Roger.
Yeah, I want to thank Robert for that comment because, yeah, when I think back, most of the government work I've done, the contract stipulates it's the intellectual property of the contractor. In some other private sector things I've done, there's been an NDA which separates out um, the intellectual property. But one of the interesting questions I would have as a sort of next step to that is if we work as a team, so what do the other team members walk away with? And so that I hadn't thought about that because I've principally thought about between the contractor, because usually most of the time I work as an individual, but if I work with a colleague and I bring on another member into the team, how do we separate out the intellectual property at the end of that? Interesting.
No, completely. Yeah. And I think I've definitely encountered, and this will vary depending on what everyone has done. And I'm like you, I also do a lot of work independently when I'm consulting and working with organizations. But there definitely have been times that things have been co-created in varying kinds of ways. And I think having clarity about, yeah, both who kind of owns it and has administrator rights, but also like how are we using this moving forward and how am I entitled to use this independently on my own without consulting you? Are there, can I take this and make derivatives of this without something else? And there's no right or wrong answer. That's a little different depending on the content that we're looking at and talking about. But I definitely think it's interesting to think about and to add to the list of kind of going into contract and checking out, but hopefully also even the beginning process of, okay, what are our expectations about this? What do we anticipate that we're going to be creating? And what are sort of the rules and expectations about that moving forward? And also then I think that sets the stage for if something comes up that is unexpected or something. I've definitely been in projects where what we think we're going to do ends up looking a little bit different as we better understand the needs and the kind of things going on, that we have that kind of language and path to revisit and be sure we're on the same page even before we get far into it. Lots of great thoughts. Yeah, so bringing awareness and reflections to this, I think, could be an interesting thing. And some of the links that I could also have some interesting things just about kind of the logistic copyright side of things in terms of, I think there's both layers that are like, okay, what have you and I agreed to? And then there's the added layer of, okay, so you and I end up in some kind of big dispute and I take this and do X thing with it. Am I legally entitled to do that without your consent based on what this project was and how it was created? Right. A lot of that stuff falls outside of my jurisdiction as not an attorney who specializes in that or an attorney at all. Um, but I think there's some really interesting things there to know uh, about a bit. Yeah, Roger, did you raise your hand new or did it not stay down? Okay, yeah, go for it, please.
Even within the case where there's no friction between any of the players,
Mhm.
um, in the beginning of my career, I did improv work. And improv work, there's a lot of reincorporation of previous things. And I find that is something I still do. So when I happen upon a particular issue that I'm trying to explain, I often look back. So how did I explain it in that project there? Or how did I explore it in that project there? So when you're working collaboratively, if I'm looking at some of the arguments that I developed with a colleague in a previous iteration, I'm going, so um, is there some sort of intellectual property or is there some sort of copyright on this? And I'm only reading the arguments to sort of recirculate them in my head. But if I were to say, oh, that's a really good explanation, and I paste this out of this document into the current project I'm doing. So it's not necessarily whether you get
Totally.
or anything, it's whether or not you end up using other people's material and even in small
Mhm.
pieces. So yeah,
Mhm.
it's a good question. Thanks.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, and that kind of links into, I think, some of the bigger questions around like the AI kinds of pieces, which also is a very expansive topic, but I think it speaks to a question that's been asked for a very long time about kind of ownership of creative works and like what is the kind of, for lack of a better word, like normal amount of being inspired by someone or being influenced by their work versus copying their work. And what does that look like, which is long time kind of been discussion in the arts world in different areas. And I think, yeah, exactly what you're speaking to. I think about all of the different teachers and instructors that I've had and the, things that they say or something that they worded in a specific way that definitely made it into my lexicon and many things that maybe I say that I'm like, I don't actually know where this came from, but it was the culmination of lots of different influences. And what does that look like? And what does that mean? And how do we like recognize and be with those pieces? And how do we, because yeah, I think outside of this question of like the legal and like, okay, are we in a legal battle and how are we making sure to cover whatever that kind of protective level? There's also this piece of like, oh yeah, what are my sort of like ethics or intentions around collaboration and using work and what does that look like and what does that mean? I think there's a lot of different kind of perspectives and takes on that and a lot of overlap happening kind of in that world of AI creation and the way, like what is that doing and changing about the art world? And, like there's so many pieces within that. And this is slightly tangential, but what you said actually makes me think of this. There's a uh, Adrienne Marie Brown, who wrote Pleasure Activism and another book, the title I'm completely blanking on. One of the things that I really appreciate that she did in that book is that she like took time, both she's like very intentional about like crediting teachers and folks that she's learned from and like really acknowledging like I'm grateful for this kind of nugget of information that I've taken from this space. So she like took time to sort of like map out like influence network for her, like her sort of personal, like these are people that I've like learned from and been influenced by who've shaped the work that I've done, that I've worked with, or that these ideas or that kind of thing, in a way that I think is really interesting that kind of feels relevant to this. So just a little sidebar there. Um, yeah, so I think definitely really interesting things. Yes, other things come up, feel free to note them and kind of go into shared screen. Oh yeah, one more thing I'll talk about kind of in the AI uh, realm. Like I think there's a lot of conversation that has happened around, folks being concerned about like, okay, is this like stepping either a taking usage of artwork that isn't someone didn't actually have usage of that then is shaping um oh, yes, totally. I'll give the author a name in the book chat for sure. Um, that's shaping AI that's being put out. And then also just kind of like questions or concerns about like, how is this shaping the art world? How is it not? Um, and I think to me, what it really makes me think of is the question of like, how do we intentionally be mindful about the digital tools that we are engaging with? And I think with a lot of things in the world, there are sometimes like clear lines on like this thing is definitely probably not problematic, and this thing on the other end is like, hey, that's problematic. But I think there's also a lot of stuff in the middle that can feel really tricky. And so, for example, like, I mean, what comes to mind for me, there was a period not that long ago, or maybe it was quite a long time recently. It's so wild. Like, maybe that was actually last year. I'm not sure. Um, but when people were making a lot of like Facebook profile images through a specific AI tool, I'm forgetting the name of, and there were a lot of like concerns and posts coming out and being shared from artists saying, like, look, this is they're taking and using artwork that they don't actually have permission to use, like scraping the internet for this. Like, please don't use this tool to generate these things, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's, questions like this that it's like, oh yeah, I didn't even think about that at the beginning. And it, makes me be like, oh yeah, I want to learn like where are they getting this information from? And what information can I learn about that? And how do I make an intentional sort of decision and choice and inform myself around this to think about things that maybe I wouldn't think about? And it is really interesting because if you look kind of online for different perspectives about AI and art and what that is and what that means, and whether it's like a good thing and a gift for the art world or a bad thing that's going to change and shape it negatively, there's a lot of different opinions, which I find very, very interesting. Yeah. So those thoughts. Um, yeah. So the book, Pleasure Activism, I'll type the author's name in a minute. I need to check spelling first. Um, but kind of going into this next one before I come out of screen share. Someone had asked, I mean, I think it's a great question, and I want to kind of pull it apart. Someone had asked, I don't remember what the exact wording was, like, what are the tools that are most kind of used and useful for consultants? And I think, I mean, it's pretty obvious, like, why that question would be asked, right? We all want to know, like, what are those? What are the tools? And I think one of the things that's like interesting to me about and kind of like why I want to pull apart this question is because I think a lot of times in the uh, in terms of the digital world, there's so much information and it can be really like overwhelming and hard to sort through that uh, it can just feel like a lot. And like, I mean, I would definitely. It's like if someone could be like, these are exactly the things that you need to use, and they're going to exactly impact your work this way. I would like absolutely want that information, right? Um, but because a lot of us are doing different types of work, different varieties of work. There may not be, a tool that is the same for all of us that we really like to use. We also may have different ways of working, where even if you and I do basically the same work and type of work, the same tool might not actually be the best for us because of the different ways that we approach work. Um, and yeah, someone's answer may not be someone else's answer. Um, I was unable to find any like actual data of like, here's the most useful, most used tools. And which makes sense because I think there probably isn't data or anyone collecting that. But that said, I do think let's talk about how do we get this information and like what is that question ultimately trying to answer? And how do we kind of get closer to the ultimate goal, which is probably like, I want the tools that are going to be most useful for me that I kind of have like proof of them working well for someone else. And so we're going to talk about kind of look at that. And I'll note too, I think when we have these kinds of questions, like if we just Google, like, what are the most common tools? You're going to get a lot of ads essentially, and a lot of like, here's a like blog written by one of the actual tools that ultimately is just saying we're the best. Right. And so it can be really hard to sort of sort through the information. And so we're going to talk about this in two ways. The first is just kind of sharing collective space for us in here to share, like, yeah, what are you using and what do you like about it? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put up a whiteboard. I invite you to just put the name of whatever you're using onto the whiteboard. And if folks are interested, like to just kind of have a sharing and discussion about like, yeah, let's see, like put up what are the tools that you're using and let's kind of talk about some of those and what's working, or if you have questions about what other people add, um, what is there to just have some of that conversation amongst ourselves. And then we'll look kind of more specifically at how do we answer this question more fully. Yeah. Yeah. So go ahead on the whiteboard. If you are on computer, you either already probably see your little like, oh my gosh, like drawing map thing. My brain's blanking on the word, the place where you can like click the pencil to draw and choose your color. If you don't see it, look for view options or more and click annotate. And then you should be able to write on it. And if you're on an iPad or an iPhone, you probably just have a little pencil on your screen already. Yeah, I invite you to just put like what are the names of the digital tools you're using if you are using things right now, just to add them to that board. Oh, it won't allow you to do it with a screen share. Like it's telling you, is everyone getting that? That it is saying, oh, you can't get in. Interesting. What kind of message are you getting, Jenny and or Robert?
I'm getting that I can't go in because I'm on a screen share, but I am doing it from an ISO because I'm on the road. So that may be
Interesting.
part of it.
Oh, okay. That's interesting though, because usually I'll find no message from Robert. Interesting, because usually I find on a like an iPhone sometimes it's even easier because there's a little pencil. Okay, well then feel free also, folks who can't get in, throw them in the chat box or just say them as well if you'd like to. Um, I'm just curious to see what are folks using and do folks have, information from one another to get? Because as I think about, man, I see stuff coming in. Yeah, I feel like Zoom's been doing some kind of funky like upgrades and things recently that are getting because sometimes there's just kind of weird things happening that are happening in ways they didn't used to be happening. So, the sweet LastPass are going to Dropbox, totally. Ooh, the Zoom AI note taker. Is that something that's just does transcription for you along the way? I'm assuming it probably is. Nice. Yeah, Salesforce. Awesome. Cool. I'm curious too, while we're in here on the other side, and then we're going to come back to this more. I'm going to open a new page. I'm curious for you to add, and also you can do this in the chat box as well or unmuted. Are there specific like categories of tools that you find yourself like most curious about or interested in like maybe integrating if you could just figure out which one actually was the right one? So it's like if you're like, oh, maybe I should be using a CRM, um, like, but you're not really sure which one. Or maybe you're like, oh, we need a communication app, but you're not sure which one. Um, Feel free to add that on this second page. And also throw the yeah, Miro. Tools. Mhm. Ooh, cool. The Zoom note taker that transcribes and adds and summarizes. Oh, great. I have not used that. Is it one of the just the Zoom app add-ons? Okay. Mhm. Yes. Fathom. Okay. Cool. Yeah, I haven't seen that one. Um, yeah, there's so many new and kind of expanding list of apps that are direct Zoom integrators, but that sounds quite nice because I have not uh, seen one that actually kind of like does any summary bits. Like I've explored different ones that do kind of varying degrees of successful transcription, but that's really cool. So thanks for noting that. Um, yeah, creation and sharing stream performances, totally. How Airtailed is used by others, sure. Yeah. And this is also good just for shaping the next weeks as well. Um, yeah, different the survey forms. Totally. And if y'all also see someone else asking a question that you're like, I have insight on this, like by all means, like feel free to share that out. Mm, mhm. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Yeah. It's I think it's interesting to see even, within our group, like going back to this original page of like, okay, so a lot of us are using Zoom. There's a lot of Google Drive happening, a little bit of Dropbox, some different folks using SurveyMonkey, different folks using Canva. Like there's certainly some overlap happening, but that all of us are using slightly different things. Um, and the reason that I'm kind of like thinking about this, I'm going to stop this share for a second and pop back in my other PowerPoint here. Is, when I think about a question of like, okay, what are other people using? Like, what is most useful and what is most used? I come back to these questions. I'll come to you right after this, Roger, but I come back to, okay, when there's a big question, looking at how do I solve this problem that isn't going to have a simple solution in terms of this data doesn't exist in a like actual reliable form, right? If you try to Google this, there'll be a million articles that are like the best tools for consultants, all owned by us, by the way, person writing the article. Um, but thinking about and kind of looking back to these theory pieces of like, okay, what is driving this question? Like often it's, I want more ease, I want more efficiency, I want less overwhelm, I want to work smarter. And how do we narrow down? Do we know what it is that we're looking for? Like, I need a tool that does exactly this thing and don't know which one to pick. Or am I in a stage where I'm like, I feel like things could be different or better? And I'm trying to figure out like what that might even be. And I know there's folks using stuff I'm not using because those approaches are going to look different. Um, and then looking kind of through these different tools that we'll talk about. But yeah, Roger, before we go further in that, thoughts, reflections, thoughts. I think your hands up, right, Roger? You're virtual. Yeah, awesome, actually. Yeah. Okay, I'll keep going a little bit. Let me know though. But I like to think about in this, right? Like who has information that might be helpful to me. So looking at who are there other consultants I know that are doing work in the same category or the same type of work or the same realm of work? And what are they using? And how do I kind of network about this specifically? And I think it's often one of those pieces that especially if you're consulting and doing kind of shorter term projects with lots of organizations, you're kind of going into an organization that probably has their fairly structured or set up whatever it is that they're using. And you're kind of in that by often kind of baptism by fire of like figure out how to use this thing. But there can still be that question like for my work, what do I use? Like what can be most useful for me? Um, and yeah, so thinking about like when you're in an organization, they do a lot of the choosing for you, right? Like whatever it is there. But when you are working for yourself, there's so many options. And looking at who else is doing this work, how can I learn from them? And also the question, the same way that people maybe bring us in as specialists or consultants on specific types of work that we're experts in, that it's also really reasonable for us to do the same thing. And it is really unreasonable that we would expect ourselves to be an expert on every possible tool that is there or to know exactly what is going to serve me and my work and my organization, my working style the best, because I don't have that knowledge, but there may be someone that does have that knowledge that can shortcut this for me. And sometimes that is the thing that makes the most sense, right? And so thinking about like what are the pain points that I'm trying to solve, And so, yeah, I'm curious, like with this, kind of looking at the whiteboards of what other people are using. Are there things that you are seeing on the list that you're like, I don't even know what that is? Like, I want to know more about that. I saw Airtable kind of come up as a topic. I'm also curious, like, what are the problems that y'all are facing that feel like there might be a different solution for this? Like, or what are the, yeah, go for it, Roger.
Aspects of this that I
Mhm.
kind of like to explore. One of
Yeah,
them is when I want to discover some new digital product, I will start to say, oh, well, let me look at a tutorial. And then you'll find out, well, like you said, there's 1,000 tutorials. Okay. And some of them are really not good at all. You sort of look at it for 5 minutes. You don't know, you're not any further.
totally.
Okay. And I'm going, gee, if somebody who went through this and discovered the right tutorial, I'd like to know which tutorial that is instead of looking through the 599 before you hit that 600th one, which is
Mhm.
the one that actually gets you going. Okay. That's one aspect of it. So
Totally.
be interesting to say, oh, if you want to do Miro, here's the tutorial that worked for me,
Yes.
kind of thing. The second aspect of it is I find that often an opportunity to develop a working relationship with a colleague, and often a colleague from another generation. Okay, so
Totally.
do I have to really know how to do SurveyMonkey, or do I know someone who does and who would like to work with me and just do it for this contract? And I've done that in a number of cases. And often I find there's younger people in the consulting business or not in the consulting business yet, but who have the knowledge base and are really interested in sharing it. And yes, come on in, let's give it a try. And that's been useful for me so far. But is there within ACCA the opportunity to either find a place to put up that list of really good tutorials, or to say, hey, if you want to run a Survey Monkey, I'll do it for you, and that kind of thing. So those are the kinds of things I'd be interested in seeing.
Yeah, I think that's a great, I think yes to both of these pieces. I'll start with the second one because that was the last one you were speaking about. Um, I'll let one of the ACCA folks talk more corely about what, they might be able to do or not do kind of in terms of those pieces. But I think the idea of like, how do we collectively support one another in this journey, knowing that there's no way that any one person can know every single thing that exists. And realistically, that even if someone's like full-time job is to be a digital consultant that goes in and, supports organizations or individuals figuring out what they need, there's so much digital overload and so many new tools rolling out all the time that it's like no one person can have a complete encyclopedic knowledge of every single possible thing that exists, right? But this idea of collectively, um, how do we share that information of even the casual list of like, I'm using these things, and yes, I am able, willing to join someone setting up their first whatever, or guide them or tell them what I like. Have a 30-minute coffee to tell you what I like about motion in person, right? Or like in virtual person. Um, because I do think that it's nice to be able to have that information and share that information. And it connects to me very much to that first one of the incredible noise that exists out there in terms of everything. And two kind of thoughts on that. And I don't know, Roger, if you were in some of the earlier ones, um, but I think it's either week one or two that we talked a little bit about some of the AI pieces that we can use to kind of shortcut basic learning if we have um, information that we're trying to like sort of like synthesize down or like weed out some of the content, which doesn't really do that piece with video. I will say that most digital tool platforms have a pretty robust like internal how to use video series that I will say often is like pretty basic and to the point often. But at least it kind of rules out the yeah, I don't even know how to say it, but it's like, yes, I've definitely fallen down the YouTube rabbit hole of being like, oh yeah, I want to learn more about this. And I click it and then it's someone's personal YouTube channel that has, lots of like really siren-y sound effects or things that I'm just like, this is not not what I want or need as I'm trying to get this basic information. And so I do find sometimes that the built-in videos on some of the sites about like basic stuff, like if you're just trying to figure out like, okay, give me the 2-minute tutorial, either on the site of the digital tool, or I find most of them have their own YouTube channel as well, where they also tend to host like cross post those videos. Um, and so looking for like if you're on Miro trying to figure it out, like the official Miro YouTube channel and looking at their videos at least tends to like eliminate some of the like annoyance factor problems that could come up from some of the other videos, I'll say. Um, so that can sometimes be useful. And I will say, like, I use ChatGPT a lot for when I'm struggling, even within a website. Like, a lot of the sites have their own sort of like forum for help and things, some of which I get annoyed by because I think it's like, their way to try to get people to get answers for themselves rather than contacting them for help when sometimes you just actually need to contact the person. Um, but when I can't find the information, I'll often use ChatGPT to be like, hey, how do I do this thing in this program? And it often will spit out, it will like cut some of that noise and like get me faster to the um, actual information that can be useful. So those are the two kind of thoughts that I have. But also, if other folks have thoughts about these things, like by all means, um, yeah, and I'll let the ACCA folks talk about, yeah, where there might be space to, yeah, kind of have some of that collective sharing unfold. And outside of like whatever they may add into that, I think about the ways that when we are gathering, or even within gatherings that are about something totally different, if we have these things in our mind to just kind of be like, hey, what are you using? What do you like? Like, what are the tools you're using a lot of? And kind of speaking to those different pieces. Yeah, because it's like, I love, does anyone else use Motion in here? I love Motion. It's been wonderful for me. And it's like, I'm super happy to talk about that because it's been awesome for me. And it may not be what you need, but it might be an interesting thing. So I'll put that on list two. But I know we're running low time today. So what I want to do is I'm going to repost in here. Let me pull it, the link to the Google like request feedbacky form. And I've taken notes of the stuff that you'll mention today in the whiteboard and want to just kind of continue on the conversations of how do we troubleshoot this? How do we problem solve this? And I'd be especially interested in kind of in this like case study realm, identifying like what are the overall categories of things that it's like, okay, yeah, I'm interested in like maybe this type of thing would be useful for me. And kind of collectively, we can go through a process that would help us like weed that down to make a better choice and kind of putting some of the theory things we talked about in the earlier videos in action. And I'll also say, I'm going to pull up the link for the previous videos too, because all of them are online from the last week's, and also we can share PowerPoints and all of that as well. So we've got lots of those things as well. But yeah, any other thoughts folks want to note as we're finding our pause point just for today? I'm trying to find the ACCA YouTube link. Beautiful. So that has links to all of those. But yeah, thank you all for being here. I know the time flies by so quickly. But yeah, I look forward to seeing y'all next week. We'll cover as much as we can again and go from there. So you'll have a great rest of your day and week. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and reflections and ideas, and see you soon.